So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining our first Marketing Moves webinar. As you'll know, we continually look to work closely with clients to build effective and successful marketing teams. Today, we hope to provide some practical advice as well as share some experiences with the senior peer group on the webinar. We'll look at ways to navigate the challenges you face when restructuring marketing teams and organisations. And throughout the webinar, you'll have a chance to contribute to the discussion through polls and our chat box. I'll be picking up any comments at points during the webinar and we can have some discussions. I'd like to introduce Jane Waight, who joins us for the session. Jane has more than 30 years experience in technology marketing across a wide range of leadership positions. I've asked Jane to share her perspectives with you today, and she will offer some practical advice and help and guidance. We'll also make a recording of this session and also hope to produce a white paper to follow up. And now I'd like to hand over to Sophie Kramhoff from Sparkle Marketing. Sophie will run through how the webinar will work.
Thank you, Mel. So yeah, I'm your host for the webinar today. So if you have any questions, please ping them to me. What we want to make sure is that you get the most out of this webinar. You have a chance to connect with Jane and connect with Mel and ask questions. How you do this is through the Q&A feature. So any questions that you have, put them in there and we'll make sure that we get them at the end of the webinar. The webinar is going to be around 45 minutes long. If you want to ask questions or if you want to share with us where you are, you can do that through the chat. If you want to share with other people, you can do that. So you share with chat to everybody. If you want to make sure and keep some confidentiality, you can just share and choose chat with panelists only. So we want to respect if you don't want your question to be shared with everybody. So that's how you engage with us. We are going to be asking some polling questions, so that please make sure you answer those. And really, this is your chance to engage. Again, I'm your host, Sophie Kramhoff, and now I'm going to hand over to Jane Waight.
Hi, everybody. Well, I think I know some of you already, and there are certainly some familiar names on the call today. And it's great to talk to you about the 5 key lessons that I've learned over far too long in IT marketing about building successful marketing organizations. As Mel said, I've spent over 30 years working in different organizations of different sizes and scales, leading teams primarily focused on marketing, often across international boundaries and cultures. Now, these days, having left corporate life, I'm now a strategic consultant and I'm based in Dorset. And frankly, I use that as an excuse to show you a very, very beautiful picture of one of the views in my local town that I'm most familiar with, now that I'm living in a place called Sherborne in Dorset. Now, it also gives me the opportunity to introduce you to our slide template theme, which is very autumnal in nature. And that's going to be something you'll become very familiar with during the course of this presentation. My aim today is to share with you some of my experiences and hopefully some practical suggestions on how best to avoid some of the traps associated with organizing a marketing team. Now, there is, I'm afraid, no universal panacea when you're building marketing teams. As Mel alluded to, what I'm hoping to do today is to give you some practical hints and tips and some suggestions that you might wish to apply. It's not rocket science, and I'm absolutely in no doubt whatsoever that most of you will probably already be doing some of these things and applying some of these ideas and practices. But hopefully, by sharing our experiences today and some of the other insights that the group may have, we can all learn something and continue to innovate and improve our approaches to building strong, robust, and successful marketing organizations and teams. So, what does it look like when organizational planning doesn't succeed? And how do you recognize a failing organizational structure? Well, often it can appear to someone who's observing a team, and again, I'm sure you can all think of plenty of examples of this, that when you look in on the team itself, it seems to you that you've got the wrong people doing the wrong jobs. So there's a mismatch of resources and placements within the team. It's not unusual to find in badly organized teams confusion amongst team members and their individual roles and responsibilities and how they're meant to work with one another, let alone how they're meant to work with colleagues and stakeholders for other parts of the business. Often there seems to be insufficient resource on the face of it, both physical and financial. So the team seems unable, despite its organisation, to deliver against requirements. And often it appears that the team are in a perpetual state of flux and confusion as to who should be doing what, when they should be doing it, and they're constantly struggling for ways to align and engage themselves effectively with other parts of the business. And most importantly, they seem unable to deliver results. So the resource trap itself, just to summarize, that organizational change, either when it's in play or indeed when it hasn't worked effectively, it can destabilize the team. Organizational change sometimes also seems to take an age. People know when the season, particularly in large organizations, when the season is about to commence for reorgs. It begins to delay day-to-day business. We also know that a lack of clarity breeds insecurity in the individual, and that distractions caused by insecurity and confusion, and the politics that also go along with all of those distractions and destabilizing factors, can be really destructive in real terms. And in those conditions, when all of those Ds are prevalent, you'll find it very difficult to produce results and to demonstrate success. And most importantly, they all contribute to building, frankly, a rather negative perception of a less than effective marketing team. And remember that for your stakeholders or your outsiders within the company, their perception of the marketing organization is their reality. So ultimately, your team will begin to be perceived as a failing organization that is not delivering against its brief. So we come then, having summarized the negative, so that hopefully people are all able to recognize a team that isn't necessarily working in a cohesive or successful way, in an organization that's failing. We come to the first lesson learned the hard way. Now, stating the obvious, focus on the individual. Now, my first rule, therefore, in building an effective team structure is to focus on the individual. And by the way, this rule applies all year round, not just when it's organizational change season. Know the individuals on your team. It's quite important. They're human beings, and remaining focused on this all year round ensures that when organizational change is required, you are in a position to be agile and able to mold your resources quickly around any new requirements and new structures that are required more effectively and more efficiently and more quickly. We're going to ask our first polling question actually at the moment, whilst you're all giving your responses to that, so that we can get a scope on just how big some of the teams are that we're dealing with here. I'll tell you a little story. Once in the 30 plus years that Mel alluded to earlier, I worked in an organization where the leadership's team vocabulary was extremely impersonal. Invariably, team members were referred to as heads, and junior team members were referred to as grunts. Now, I constantly had to remind the people that use that vocabulary that we were talking here about individuals. They weren't shrunken heads. They weren't objects. They were smart, dedicated people with well-developed skills. They weren't just bodies. And as a leader, it's vital that you get under the skin of your team members, or in larger teams, that you have managers who get under the skin of the individual team members and understand them as individuals. Understand the past experiences that they may have that may be pertinent for future requirements. Understand their goals and aspirations. Through a selection of activities, you can regularly appraise and evaluate individual performances as well on an ongoing basis. You can also evaluate the personal values of your team members and their traits, their deepest aspirations, ambitions, and motivations. And it's important, if you're going to build an effective structure, that you understand and try and cater for those when you build your team. Currently, the trend in some of the world's largest organizations is actually to move away from the annual appraisal model. After all, I mean, it's pretty logical. Why wait a year to tell somebody that they're failing in a job and take corrective action with training and development that's going to come too late to affect that year's performance and their contribution to the business? The latest trend is far more towards a logical, constant, always on, ongoing performance discussion based around clear performance goals, output goals, and key performance indicators that are relative specifically to that person's role and contribution to the team. Increasingly also, leaders are tracking on attitudinal and behavioral traits of individuals. Very simple things that humans really need to value in one another, such as trustworthiness, integrity, friendliness, willingness to help others on the team, efficiency, commitment to getting the job done, honesty, and not playing politics. So increasingly, those traits are increasingly valued within organizations who are looking to build really effective teams, and consciously they're evaluating their staff along those criteria as well. Identify too those who have aspirations to lead in the longer term. It's worth noting that just because somebody's good at being an individual contributor and excels in a particular role, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be a great leader of a function delivering in that area. Acceptance is another little element of understanding the individual. And this really, to put it quite bluntly, is get over it. Accept and resign yourself that you will not be able to choose every single member on that team from the beginning. You will inherit people. You'll have people on the team who maybe aren't performing particularly well, but you can't wave a magic wand and start with the dream bench from the get-go. So always make sure that whilst you're resigned to having people that you may not ideally have chosen yourself, you need to get the best out of them in the short term, but develop a longer-term replacement plan and actually have a perspective on the individuals that you might want to replace in due course, and try and take corrective action if you can, but be ready to replace on a longer-term basis. Now, actually, Mel, before we move on, it might be worth briefly returning to the point about appraisals, because I know that in the past, when leading large teams, I've often been told that with contract staff, there are limitations as to what a line manager might be able to do in terms of a performance review without incurring employers' liability. But that's obviously no excuse for not giving contractors clear performance goals and guidance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from the outset, we want to have clear, I mean, you mentioned KPIs, clear goals, clear objectives. Because I think even contract staff, when they're coming on board, want to understand, how do I affect results? How do I deliver performance? So clarity at the beginning. I think through the contracting agency, in this case marketingmoves, very much it's still an informal review process, say on a quarterly basis, but we do carry out annual performance reviews as well. So quarterly, more informal, yearly is the more formal one. And I think through that, people can understand where they're delivering, how they can deliver better results, and give feedback. And it touches on the attitudinal side of things as well, so we can pick up on potential issues or potential opportunities, because obviously a lot of contract staff do end up being permanent staff going forward, and can play a key role in the team.
Thanks. So yeah, understand therefore what's working, what isn't, and what worked and didn't work before from the existing structure, but focus on understanding the individuals. Now, the next rule for me is probably the singularly most important element of any restructure for a marketing team. And it's also, by the way, in my view, the singularly most important reason why marketing teams fail. Namely, understanding the priorities for the business and for marketing through the business plan, and devising a team structure and goals that are going to deliver against those objectives. I've worked in companies in the past, and quite a few of them actually, where I've been told that, well, there is no business plan, there's just a sales plan. We're just too busy and too successful to have a proper business plan. And, you know, just get on and market and support the business. My advice to you is, if you find yourself in this unfortunate position, is that if you don't have a set of strategic priorities, which you can build a team structure around, then get one. Otherwise, you will fall into that resource trap. You'll become directionless, reactive, and tactical responders to ad hoc requests and often misidentified needs and requirements from other parts of the business. And you'll be driven into doing more and more activities that are frankly off-piste. And often, as an observation, that's where sales support can come to dominate over marketing requirements. So without putting anybody on the spot about your current situation, here's the next polling question. Have you ever in your career felt ill-informed, or have you always felt fully informed about your company's priorities? Now, whilst you're mulling over that question, let's just quickly run through the area of strategic alignment. It's absolutely imperative, as I mentioned last slide, that you're conscious of how you can support the ideally prioritized list of company strategic objectives, including considerations of how that's going to manifest itself at a practical and a tactical level in terms of resource allocation. As part of this process, you can define what your output historically may have been in support of contextual things rather than core. We'll come to that in a moment when we talk about function and form. By that I mean, what is the core function of the team? What are the core skills that are required? Rather than contextual, if you like, contextual skills and activities. So you can define what is required in terms of output, skills, and resources to deliver against those priorities. Whether that's full-time contract or indeed deciding that a particular need can only be met by outsourcing a particular function, perhaps to a specialist agency. You can also define here from an output perspective how you're going to measure your ability to support those strategic priorities. And very importantly, you're also defining what will not be supported, as well as what will be. Have we had any responses?
Yes, we actually have. So let's have a look at the polling one for that, for the second one there. I'll just share the results here. So 25% of people say yes, they did feel informed, 50% say no, and 25% said partly. So I think that's very much in line with my experience as well.
Great, yeah, so 75% of us could have been better informed about strategic priorities. That's incredibly, that's quite meaningful actually in the context of this discussion, as we were saying earlier, because it's almost as though you're a bit blind, frankly, when building a team, if you're not clear what you're actually trying to support. Safe to say, it's imperative that you do get a set of strategic priorities. And if you don't have them, then either demand them or define them yourself and then get them ratified. So next we come to function and form. For me, this is the third element of the process. And normally I try to address this part of the process in complete isolation. And I mean, I would leave the company building. I try and find a padded cell or a quiet room somewhere without any consideration of the individuals. So having thought about the individuals all year round, when it comes to function and form, don't think about the people, think about the function and the form. It's important to be dispassionate and objective when you're going through this part of the process. Consider the strategic objectives that you're going to be supporting and work down the stack as you start to break out those strategic priorities into a set of actionable programs with the tactical deliverables and the outputs that you're going to be producing. Then start to think about the ideal composition of skills and functions, not individuals, but skills and functions that you would need to deliver against this requirement. Consider how to best align against the business needs. Should your organization, for example, mirror the structure of the business, or would it be better to have some of those commonly required skills and expertise on particular areas, centralized, so that you can generate some economies of scale and avoid duplication of skills if you're short of resources. Now, I've seen this done particularly well with the contextual functions that we mentioned earlier, such as messaging, web content, direct marketing skills, and so on, where you've got core functions sitting in individual teams facing outwards to their stakeholders in the business, which we'll talk about in a little while, and contextual services sitting within marketing who will support across all parts of the individual groups within the team. This can often work well if you've got creative expertise in-house that might operate on a cross-discipline basis. And it will also help you to identify where those functions might be best outsourced, should you be unable to find the right skill set on your team, particularly if perhaps there's a short-term requirement and there's budget available. There's no point in trying to create and invent that function for yourself on your team in-house. So consider how you can develop a robust structure that enables you to drive good coordination across the business functions. Ideally, if you have the resource, with dedicated team leaders or group leaders who can work together during the course of the year to ensure that they're operating together in an efficient way, that they're collectively prioritizing projects efficiently, effectively, and successfully. Now, this is an area, when we look at function and form, where your human resources team may be offering you help. I have found, however, that sometimes the value, I mean, firstly, never ever say no to support from HR, but that the value of the HR team can sometimes be a bit limited by their lack of understanding around specific marketing functions and activities. But always keep them close if they're offering support, because HR can always too be a way to influence the senior management within the organization, from whom you may be trying to secure additional resources, whether that's physical or fiscal additional resources. So we've talked about stakeholders, we've mentioned them a couple of times. Now let's dig down really into the fourth rule around organizational structure. It took me, I have to say, and again, mea culpa, it took me probably 10 to 15 years to come to terms with the fact that this isn't selling. And before we dig into the detail here, it's probably helpful to understand how many stakeholders you on the bridge are engaging with in support of business objectives. Stakeholders or internal customers, perhaps you might describe them as. So look forward to hearing about that in due course. So as I mentioned, this isn't selling, it's show and telling, and it's not a waste of time. You need to make sure that your organizational structure has a logic to it, that you can communicate to your internal stakeholders. So you're not being defensive, you're not an apologist for your organization, but it's important that you ensure that your internal stakeholders, particularly those who've got responsibility for the achievement of the big strategic objectives, understand how you've structured the team and why, particularly since these individuals may actually be the ones who've got the additional resources and the budget that you could tap into. And they're also the people that you need to support with your own marketing leadership. So before you implement your organizational restructure, ideally take the time to walk each of your stakeholders, or indeed the entire leadership team, through your logic for the structure of your marketing organization. Now, by doing this, you are demonstrating transparency, you're working with your peers, and of course, you're managing expectations from those within the business and from whom you may need support.
And Jane, I'll just add there, from the poll results, it looks like most people are managing up to 5 stakeholders on average.
Great. Well, hopefully this point then will resonate with you, as they say, because the other key element to it, of course, is that you're demystifying marketing for the executives along the way. You're not just selling your organization and the rationale behind it, but you're demystifying and helping them to understand how and where marketing supports their business. Now, it's also an opportunity not just to show and tell and to ratify and to negotiate around your new structure. It helps you avoid potential objections further down the line. And it's a good time to secure agreement that your structure does support the goals for the business and that you're aligned to the business. And it helps avoid further down the line objections from stakeholders who may feel that they're entitled after 6 to 8 months to turn around and say, well, I failed to achieve my business goals because I didn't understand the marketing structure and it wasn't adequate for my needs. So head it off at the pass up front, get their buy-in and their support. It's a good idea too to be aware of the informal power structures and the internal power structures and key influencers within the organization. And to identify the most influential and key opinion formers in that leadership team. In addition, post-internal restructure, or indeed during it, please bear in mind your external stakeholders. I've seen on several occasions across different organizations, many examples where the failure to communicate marketing structural changes and organizational structure has directly affected commercial business partners. And remember, route to market partners are in effect customers. It's important to ensure that there's transparency with those partners as to how the team looks, who their main points of contact are going to be, how processes will work. Don't let a marketing reorganization detrimentally affect the business and risk causing any interruption or disruption to sales and marketing activities to the customer. I've seen organizational change that has either been poorly communicated or not communicated at all to partners really have damaging results on sales numbers. In addition, it's also very important, and I know this is, logic to most of us, but it's also important to communicate organizational changes on rationale and structure to your marketing partners, such as agencies and specialists in various elements of the mix. And I know Mel feels pretty strongly about this as a recruitment partner as well, actually.
Yeah, I was going to jump in there, Jane, just to say that I'd like to stress that I think it's extremely important that recruitment partners are included in sort of the communication around goals and objectives, what the organisation is trying to achieve. So I think that puts the recruitment partner in a much stronger position to identify the correct candidates and the cultural fit. And then going forward, we can pre-screen candidates and develop a pool of high quality candidates ready to go. And we did that very successfully with Cisco, with Orange, with Box. Companies included us in their sort of early stages of their recruitment process, understood what they're trying to achieve, and then we have, as I say, a range of candidates, significant time savings, and then hence significant monetary savings as well.
Thank you. Yeah, one last point to mention here about your stakeholders. I'd encourage you to quite consciously identify some opportunities for some quick wins. After you've ratified and negotiated around the structure and what resources you are putting in place in support of the individual stakeholders and their business needs, try and identify some quick wins that you'll be able to secure within the first few months of a reorganization in an effort to reassure your stakeholders, to garner increased confidence and, if necessary, increased investment, but really try and make sure that you've got some opportunities to demonstrate that the new structure is working and is supporting them well early on in the process, to reassure them and get their support right behind you and make sure that the marketing organization or reorganization is perceived as a success that it will be. So finally, we come to closing the loop. We started talking about individuals. We talked about how to perhaps determine the optimum structure for the functions against the business requirements in your team. It's now important to take the time to ensure that the team itself are clear on the structure of the reorganization and the thinking that supports it. So communicate to your team, nurture your team, being clear about the function and the role that each individual fills within the team, and its clear focus on adding value to the business in a measurable way can really lift the team's morale and demonstrate to your stakeholders as well that you're supporting the business in a productive and a considered way. Now, this is easier to do, of course, if all your people are in one place. It can take a lot longer and be a little bit more tricky if you've got a distributed organization. Are all your team members located in one place, or are you dealing with remote team members? That issue, by the way, of having individuals that are perhaps out on a limb, as we might say, or sitting out perhaps in a country team whilst working for a central team, or sitting as the only marketing person in a particular organization that's some distance geographically from your team, can prove difficult. But it's well worth making the effort. You should be very conscious, again, in my experience, of the geographical isolation factor that needs to be counteracted. Be aware of that in your team communications. Don't let people feel that they're out on a limb, isolated, removed. They're also, by the way, quite liable to be distracted by priorities and needs at a tactical level closer to home. So embrace those individuals and make them feel part of the team. Even if you don't have a huge travel budget, you can still make sure that they feel they belong.
And Jane, just on the poll results there, the 100% was people are working in remote teams. No one had a team or base in the same location.
Now, we can talk about this perhaps on I know we don't have a lot of time today to drill into it, but there are a number of hints and tips around managing distributed organizations. But I can't stress enough that communication is first and foremost on that list. And indeed, embracing the diversity, but making sure that you over-communicate if necessary around the functions and the expectations for all of those individuals. You can still feel part of a team, even if you're not necessarily all sitting in the same room every day of the week. So clarify on expectations, clarify on the structure, articulate the success that you're going to generate collectively. Most importantly, be aware, again, just as you were with your stakeholders, of the informal structures and the influences, and frankly, acknowledge that there is going to be cynicism there that you may not necessarily see directly. There are influential individuals who can help generate enthusiasm for the structure or potentially form a canker that's going to build negativity from within. You've got to get those people on board. I did actually, I think we've got time for a quick anecdote. I once ran quite a sizable team across multiple locations, and I identified after about 6 months that somebody who was indeed closest to me geographically, not a particularly senior member of the team, but boy, that person was a ne'er-do-well, a naysayer. I had to focus on that chap because even if he was motivated in theory, being successful, being productive, the nature of the beast was that he was constantly niggling with others about, oh, it's never going to work, this isn't going to work. Oh, you know, he was a negative influence on the team. Find out who those individuals are and try and influence them and get them on board. But acknowledge that cynicism will exist, and your team leaders will be pretty important in helping you to achieve that. So from a practical perspective, how can you do that? Well, examine and discuss with the team, what is success going to look like? Paint some pictures, as well as collectively look at how individuals are going to be advanced by these changes and rewarded as a result of the collective success through that new structure. Going back to your team leaders, it's important that you can demonstrate to them too how they're going to be empowered to support the strategic priorities, and also that you're relying on them to work in groups to ensure operational success and to keep those communication channels open constantly about what's working and what's not working in the new structure. Lastly, I would really strongly recommend that you make it real for those team members and enable each of them to see how they fit into the new team, to understand their role, and to see opportunities for personal growth and achievement. So try and provide and demonstrate to them that you're providing an environment where people can test out their dreams and their aspirations, but help them collectively as a group to agree on what we're all going to accomplish with the mission, the goals, and the metrics for the team, why we should be doing it with your vision statement, your incentives, how you're going to do it, so your team strategy relative to that of the organization, and the plans and the activities that you're going to achieve that success with. And lastly, of course, who is going to do what? What are the individual roles and responsibilities that will deliver the vision, with key performance indicators to help energize and reassure that team. Enable them to be energetic, happy, and productive by being clear about what you expect from each of them.
Jane, if I think you've touched on there around the clear communication and the clarity of the brief, and I think clarity of performance indicators, the clear tactical focus, I think that's very important to make sure that everyone feels part of the team and have a clear understanding of what we're trying to achieve and aim for. And I think that sort of stops people working in a vacuum. It actually, helps us. We talked about dispersed teams. It helps everyone work as a combined team. I think I would apply that for people joining the business, but also for people that have been in the business for several years. So I think that's important to have that clarity around the brief and the KPIs.
So, as I mentioned earlier, for stakeholders, it's important to demonstrate that your organizational structure is working, but it's also very important for the team itself. So within the first couple of weeks, work with the team leaders to determine where you can achieve those quick wins to demonstrate the success of your new look marketing organization and make it real for the team members themselves. These quick wins should be sufficient for the short term to demonstrate that the structure is working and that you're effectively supporting the business goals, and help generate support from your stakeholders as well as from people in the team for the new structure and any additional proposals that you might have for further resources. So now's a good time, it's working really well. Please, sir, could I have some more? Generate some confidence in the short term, and then perhaps you're in a position to go out and start shaking a few trees as to what you could do with any additional resource or budget that might come your way, an additional success that you could generate for the business. So we've gone through this at quite a whirlwind pace, but in summary, try to anticipate change on the horizon by addressing those 5 rules on the checklist around a reorg for marketing. They're all very common sense suggestions and learnings. They're recommendations and learnings and lessons that I've found it helpful to implement as a thought process, really, when presented, and quite often presented at very short notice with the need to realign and reorganize resources. Sometimes it's been required overnight. So having these things in the back of your mind all the time as a good marketing leader will hold you in good stead. But be mindful of these 5 practical, actionable rules and considerations next time you go through the cycle, and hopefully your marketing organization will be a very, very successful one. And now I'll hand you back to Mel.
Thanks, Jane. Just before we finally conclude, I was just going to touch on the frequency and timing of restructures, because I think that can have a significant impact on a lot of what we discussed today around the marketing resource trap. So if we haven't got sufficient resources, there's no clarity around responsibilities, and restructures, when they're handled badly, that can have a huge impact on the business. So it'd be interesting to sort of, I guess we've all got examples or experiences of restructures that have happened badly, and hear that from people on the webinar today, because it can leave everyone in a state of flux and being very unproductive. So if anyone wants to share any thoughts on that, then please do so through the chat. Anything you'd like to add there, Jane?
Well, I think it's a really great point, actually, and the damage that can be done can last a very, very long time during the course of the year. And as I started off by saying, the perception across your stakeholders is their reality. So, you know, if they're not satisfied, you could well be going down a route to failure. But it's important, the over communicating around stakeholders and your team, as well as all your business partners, is really critical. Are there any other comments or questions from the group before we conclude?
We had a question or a comment around, with millennials, you need to provide ongoing input, different to what most organizations are structured for, which is, you know, the quarterly or yearly review. And I know, Mel, you answered this a little bit in the chat, but Jane, maybe also your view on this. And again, maybe also it touches on how different people are. Some people may need feedback weekly, others may be okay with once a year.
Well, my view would be they may be okay with getting feedback once a year, but in the interests of the effectiveness of the marketing team, it should probably be a little bit more often than that. And I do agree, new millennials in particular, when you look at the nature of the beast, are probably much more open to having ongoing feedback on a almost day-to-day basis, as well as having their longer term sort of quantitative goals and expectations. Yeah, I mean, as we were saying, why wait a year to tell somebody that it's not quite working out when they've done potentially quite a lot of damage, both to the business, but also potentially to their own levels of motivation and enthusiasm. Everyone would rather know if there's something they could be doing better.
Yeah, and I think if there's positive feedback, there's maybe different ways of doing it. Is that, you know, doing it in front of the team? Is that, you know, doing a LinkedIn recommendation? I think there's also many ways, and maybe we can cover this on another topic, but there's many ways to do that feedback as well in different forms, both, you know, obviously, you know, you don't want to do the public, the negative one too public, but, you know, just thinking out loud there.
Yeah, I think working with your team leads at a collective level, and indeed talking with the whole group about what's been working from a collective perspective is also important, as well as having those individual conversations, either directly yourself or through your team leaders, understanding the individuals.
So that's the only questions that we've had today. So I'll hand over to Mel now.
Okay, thanks, Sophie. Thanks, Jane. Just wanted to finally thank everybody for taking part today. Thank you, Jane, for talking us through the marketing resource trap and giving us some very pragmatic and practical advice there. I think all of us would agree we could spend at least a day on each of these subjects and delve a lot deeper. So if you'd like further discussion with Jane around marketing organisation, Jane's contact details are on the screen now. And obviously from a recruitment perspective, my contact details are there as well. This is the first in a series of webinars we're going to be running. So if there are topics that people would like us to cover, please comment and contact us direct or send through the chat subjects you'd like to cover, such as we've touched on dispersed teams there. So maybe, you know, managing international teams, managing international stakeholders, effective resource mapping, these types of things. So they're the sorts of topics we're going to be looking to cover going forward. So finally, thanks again for everyone for taking part today.